Paul Harrell, weekdays from 4 to 6. Learn more at paulharrell.com.
Had the privilege of sitting down with Congressman Rick Crawford, and we talked about tax reform. It's a two-part interview. We're going to get to the first part now and the second part later in the show. We also mentioned, Congressman Rick Crawford is a veteran himself. It is Veterans Day tomorrow. Here is Congressman Rick Crawford. Joining us now, we have Congressman Rick Crawford back with us. Rick, good to have you on as always.
Hey, good to be here.
Wanted to talk about the news of the day. Really the last couple of weeks, but, the House has their tax plan out, and tax reform is, it's on a lot of Americans' minds because, I think a lot of people need relief. The Senate bill came out, I believe, yesterday, and so a lot of people are now comparing the Senate bill and the House bill. As a matter of fact, that's what I was just doing. So let's just start on the House side where you have influence. What were those negotiations like, or what can you tell us about the process in the House and how you guys came to some of your ideas?
Well, it hasn't been a deal that just sort of was thrown together in a couple of days. I mean, it's been a lengthy process. There's been a lot of input. There's, the Ways and Means Committee, to their credit, has been working tirelessly on this thing. And so, I've got some concerns about some of the outside, criticisms of the bill, although, it's not a perfect bill by any stretch of the imagination. Nothing ever is. But the main thing to keep in mind is, the approach to provide some tax relief to middle-income Americans and simplify the tax code. And in doing that, the ultimate goal being, number one, tax relief for working folks, and number two, empowering the economy and creating the environment for economic growth, which really we haven't had, in any real measurable form over the last, 8 to 10 years. It's been fairly stagnant. And so, as an example, you look at a country like Panama. They've had anywhere from 7 to 12% growth over a sustained period of probably 8 to 10 years. That same period that we were sort of stagnant, they've been growing their economy, and they don't make a single thing in Panama. They are strictly a service economy, and yet they've been able to grow their economy in a time when the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, has been sort of mired in malaise. And so, look, how do we unleash our economic engine? I think it starts with tax reform, and essentially putting more money back in the pockets of the people that earned it, and allowing corporations to reinvest in their business. And I'm talking about small businesses here. You use the term corporations, and people automatically, tune you out, and they conjure this image of these big, faceless corporations. And when you talk about corporations, you're talking about not these faceless corporations in New York or Chicago or something like that. You're talking about the small business owner that you go to church with, or that's your neighbor or whatever. They own a small business. And look, if you provide that level of tax relief to those corporate entities as well as everyone else, they're going to be able to reinvest in themselves. They're going to be able to, grow their business, hire an additional employee or two or three. And, small business is the backbone of our economy. So we need to be thinking about that in those terms. It's not just about, this idea that these big global corporations are benefiting. No, everybody is in the global economy. If you're in business today, you're competing in a global economy. And so we need to make sure that our tax code reflects that.
I'm glad to hear you say that, and I'm really glad to hear you talk about, this misconception about corporations and how there are a lot of, job creators and small business owners that are, they have, quote, corporations, if you will. My whole thing, and I know I always, try to get philosophical on this, but, to me, sometimes when we say we're trying to get tax reform for working families, which is great and it's a good goal, but I kind of feel like we teeter on this idea of dividing Americans into groups, which is kind of something that the left is pretty good at. But, I think we need to have the context of, look, just because, you make X amount of dollars or you're a wealthy person, that doesn't somehow make you a bad person or a part of the problem. Matter of fact, you're probably, like you said, investing, and you're going to be a job creator.
Right. Look, nobody likes to hear this, but the reality is, job creators are the ones we should, be thinking about, because if I own a business and I have freed up more money that my business has earned, the default response from those people on the left is that you're just a greedy, money-grubbing individual trying to line your pockets. That's not the case. You want to expand your business. To expand your business, you need to hire good people. And those good people are, as I said, those are your neighbors, your friends, people that you go to church with. We need to get past this sort of baseline default position that the left uses to malign those of us that work hard for our money and job creators. I mean, I've been a business owner before. I had employees that I paid to do a job, and I wasn't a big business. Heck, I think at the peak I had maybe 11 employees. That's not a whole heck of a lot, but to those 11 employees, it mattered. And it was a big part of their life where they work. That's critical. You spend a big portion of your day out there, trying to earn some money to make ends meet. So, what if you had, even if it weren't necessarily that you're going to expand, and hire 150 new people, maybe you just, in a position to give your current employees a little bit of a raise, in addition to the tax relief that the employees are getting. I mean, it doesn't have to always be this negative connotation, but for those on the left, that's the position they start from, and you'll never satisfy them.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. You won't ever satisfy them. That's so I want to kind of talk about some of the specifics here, and I want to start with, I think, what could affect Arkansas the most. The state and local tax deduction being eliminated. Okay, the House passed on that idea, but the Senate plan puts it back in, and I think the main reason is they don't really have any representatives, because the Senate only has 2 people per state, from California or New Jersey or some of these higher tax states in the Republican conference up there. So talk a little bit about that. I mean, that would affect Arkansans in terms of we would no longer be able to write off our state and local tax deductions because, we kind of have higher taxes than anybody else around in Arkansas and any of our neighbors. So what are your thoughts on that process?
Okay, here's the thing, and I think this is what we have to wrestle with here at home. So we're trying to do our part at the federal level to provide tax relief, to simplify the tax code, and you have to do that kind of with a broad perspective. So good and bad with that. In Arkansas, we are probably the highest tax rate of all our touch states. Most of our touch states don't even pay income tax. So there's some things we could do. That sort of should be a pretty strong signal to our state legislators. Hey, look, if we're not going to be able to deduct state and local taxes anymore, maybe we need to think about some state-level tax relief and figure out a way that we can do our part at the state level as well. And so what you're hearing about from in New Jersey and New York, Massachusetts, California, and states like that, their state legislatures have had the safety net of being able to raise taxes at the state and local level and just be able to fall back on you could write it off your federal income tax, your federal tax return. Well, basically then what we're doing is subsidizing bad tax policy at the state level. So I don't say this because, look, I know that my counterparts in the state legislature are doing their part to try and roll back in a meaningful way to revise tax code. Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin has been one of the staunchest supporters of wholesale tax reform in the state of Arkansas.
Yes.
And I agree with that. I think we need to go bold with that. I don't think there's any reason why we should allow our touch states to outperform us and to outbid us on potential companies that are looking for a new place to locate. And then, our tax code's not as competitive as Mississippi, so we lose the big plant to Mississippi or whatever. You see what I'm saying is that this should be a call to the state legislators to, let's do some things. And we've got them in Arkansas that they get it, and they're working on that very thing. But the idea, it's not near as bad in Arkansas as it is in, say, states like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, California, where they have insanely high taxes, and they raise taxes just about every year with the, disclaimer that, oh, well, you can take this off your federal taxes. And that just seems like we're subsidizing bad governance.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, it would probably force some of these blue states to have to rethink, what their local policy is as well. And so we'll see what happens. Like I said, it's in the Senate plan now, and I know you guys will have to, go to conference and work out the differences of each one of the plans, the competing plans?
Yeah, that's probably the process. And here's one thing I want to point to, though. As we see now, the Senate has always sort of, kind of sat back and, the world's greatest deliberative body, and we have to, really be very deliberate in our process and all this other kind of thing, and they don't get in a really big hurry. Well, they jumped out here in a real big hurry and put together a tax policy. So whether you disagree or agree with the tax policy that they are presenting, what they have demonstrated is, in fact, they can work quickly when they need to. It's just that when they choose to, they sit back and they adopt that sort of posture of, well, we have to cool things off. Those folks in the House, they get to a boiling point. They're the cup, where the boiling tea is poured into, and we're the saucer, and we cool it all off.
Yeah.
Because they're the upper chamber, and they just, we got to put. Well, you see for yourself, when they want to do something, they can do it.
Yeah.
Now, here's the other thing that's going to become a major encumbrance to what they're doing, is the filibuster rule and the reconciliation guidelines. So under reconciliation, this can be considered at $1.4 trillion. As long as they stay within the confines of that $1.4 trillion, then they only require 51 votes. There's nothing in the Constitution that prescribes that. They control the majority in the chamber, and they can change those rules if they want to. And so people are saying, why aren't we getting anything done? There you go. It's not unconstitutional to change the rules in the body. Okay? That's what that body does. They choose to use that really, in my opinion, antiquated procedural maneuver under the auspices of protecting the minority. Well, look, every 2 years, the American people speak. And what we have in Congress during that 2-year period, and Congress convenes every 2 years, even though senators are only elected on a 6-year cycle, we have a new Congress every 2 years. And that is a snapshot in time of what the people want. And what the people want right now is some quick action on things like health care and tax reform. And yet the Senate is clinging to these old arcane rules that do not exist in the Constitution for some institutional reason. And it's really becoming a major impediment to advancing any kind of conservative agenda in Congress.
Yeah. To our interview, Congressman Rick Crawford sat down with us or called in earlier this morning, and it sounded like this.
Period. And Congress convenes every 2 years, even though senators are only elected on a 6-year cycle. We have a new Congress every 2 years, and that is a snapshot in time of what the people want. And what the people want right now is some quick action on things like health care and tax reform. And yet the Senate is clinging to these old arcane rules that do not exist in the Constitution for some institutional reason. And it's really becoming a major impediment to advancing any kind of conservative agenda in Congress.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, is it for the institution's sake? I mean, or is it a crutch to try to prevent, what the people want? I mean, I think that's what a lot of people are now starting to ask themselves is what are the motivations here? Just real quick, comparing some of this stuff, the business tax, okay, the House comes out and says, hey, your pass-through business is not going to be taxed any more than 25%. Senate's coming back and is putting that right over 30%, I think 31%. Interestingly enough, the Senate plan has the corporate tax cut delayed until 2019. The House is 2018. Which is weird. I really was hoping for a retroactive tax cut, of course, beggars can't be choosers, I guess. But I was hoping for at least it to be retroactive. But I don't think that's going to happen to this year. Here's an interesting point, Rick. We're talking with Congressman Rick Crawford. So the House plan eliminated the death tax, which is amazing. That is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
The Senate is trying to keep it but raise the threshold, and I'm sure they're doing that so that they can eliminate the concept of, family farm, and now you're going to have to sell the farm. But, I really think in some cases here, the principle of the matter is you've already paid taxes on this money.
Right.
Why in the world, after you're dead, do you have to pay taxes again on your hard work? And that principle, as far as the Senate goes, is kind of being thrown out the window. And I think the Republicans have a real opportunity to say, you know what, the government doesn't have a right to your money after you're dead.
Well, listen, I've written extensively on this years ago. I mean, this has been something I've been trying to deal with since before I was ever elected. The estate tax is punitive in principle, and it's not about changing the thresholds and all this other kind of nonsense. It's ridiculous, and it's punitive to small businesses, farmers and ranchers across the country, who may be their assets are primarily in land. They're not cash-rich entities, but when that operator dies, and he's trying to pass that on, even through some very creative estate planning, in many cases. You're going to pay an inordinate amount of taxes just to pass that on to the next generation. Well, why are we in this? How do we realize the American dream if not to pass it down generationally? This is in principle, bad tax policy, and it's not really even a significant revenue generator. So why do we keep it?
Right.
And so I don't understand that at all. I thought we had it right in the House policy on the estate tax, and that's something to me that's worth mentioning. Is that what I think they're trying to do is garner some support from some red state Democrat senators like Joe Manchin, Heidi Heitkamp, John Tester, and a couple of others, because there's going to be some holdouts on the Republican side, like Rand Paul, who says no to everything, and there may be a couple others that say no. John McCain, who lately is trying to figure him out, not just lately, but he has a history of being difficult to predict. So you don't know that you've got 51, even under the reconciliation deal. You don't know that you have 51, and so I think they may be throwing some bones to some potentially vulnerable red state Democrats, those individuals that I mentioned, in the hope that maybe they'll come along too.
Interesting.
To me, it's a gambit that I don't. Look, we've got an opportunity to really express a set of principles here, and that's certainly one of them. That is such a ridiculous tax. You can say what you want about it. The other side, oh, you're just trying to protect all these big corporations. That's bull. This gets back to my whole point about. Look, here's the other thing. I mean, most of these small businesses, as you mentioned before, they're going to be pass-through entities. They're LLCs, subchapter S corps, and whatever, but they're still corporate entities. But what you're going to see now, probably if we can't reduce that rate, is they'll all have to go to like a C corp structure or whatever. Then everything in the country is going to be corporate.
Yeah.
And that's a misnomer. It's misleading to the American people. It's like saying these when people use the term corporate farmers. Well, yeah, they're corporate. What do you expect them to farm out of a spiral notebook?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, heck, they've got to have some sort of corporate structure just to operate. Otherwise, you're going to have the IRS camped out on your doorstep. And so whether you're a subchapter S, an LLC, or whatever your corporate entity, you have some corporate structure, not just C Corp, but every business.
Yeah. Hey, let me ask you this. We have, there's a few reports. I guess a week ago today, the report came out that the House plan had a hidden 45.6% tax bracket that was not really in there. So, if you're at $1 million or something, your next 200,000 is going to be taxed at 6%. And so a lot of people were critical of that. And look, there's criticism, all the way around here. Generally speaking, I do think it's hard to get people to commit. It shouldn't be, but commit to the principles of, conservative Republican tax reform that a lot of people have campaigned on. And I know you guys are obviously you're trying, you're doing the best. But to me, let me ask you this. Do you get the feeling that they want to do tax reform, but it's more like a revenue-neutral tax reform where they protect the amount of revenue that the government's getting so they don't have to cut spending?
I think what you have kind of I don't think it's so much that. I think it's the idea that being attacked if you're a fiscal hawk, you're a budget hawk, and you don't want to, you want to cut spending, you want to do all these kinds of things, that if you don't have the revenue neutral position as it applies to taxation, then somehow that's conflicting. But we've seen through, the Reagan tax cuts and the Kennedy tax cuts that they pay for themselves. They weren't offset. In fact, just the opposite. They increased revenues to the Fed. So the idea that now we've got to pay for tax cuts, I mean, they are sort of self-funding mechanisms.
Yes.
I mean, actually, you increase revenues. Now, the other part of this deal is we should be talking about cutting spending. Most definitely need to cut spending. I think we need to go to appropriating every bit of federal spending instead of the mandatory versus discretionary. I think it all ought to be discretionary. I think every federal agency should have to present a budget and should have to demonstrate good management and should have metrics for success. And look, we have finite resources, and 66%, about 67% of those resources are on autopilot. Mm-hmm. We're just fighting over the discretionary side, and we've got defense is discretionary spending, for crying out loud. That's one of the things that we shouldn't even have to fight about. I mean, that's a constitutional mandate. One of the first things in there, provide for the common defense. So those are some things that frustrate me. And then, of course, underlying all this is that we have no fundamental structural mechanism in place to force Congress to behave appropriately. And what I'm talking about, as you've heard me say before, is either a balanced budget amendment, which some folks recoil at, or a spending limitation amendment that caps spending as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah, absolutely. And I I love the capping it at a percentage of GDP because, government, it exists, reinforces this idea that, hey, government exists only because you've got the people out there creating jobs, the people working and paying for the government, and so as the economy grows, then the government is allowed to spend. Real quick, I know we're running out of time here, but Congressman Rick Crawford, tomorrow, Saturday, is Veterans Day. I read a blog post, and first of all, I want to thank you for your service as an Army Explosive Ordnance Disposal Technician. I've said this before about people who go into service. I mean, they have more courage than I think I will ever have. Just because of what you guys sacrifice and the potential. You sign up for the potential sacrifice of giving your life. But I read a blog post that you wrote about rural America, and you mentioned that rural America produces more veterans than any other single community. Why do you think that is?
Well, as a percentage of the population, that's true, and it's not just me sort of anecdotally observing that. Man, we have a lot of veterans from Marshall or Cotter or Fox or whatever. But as a percentage of the population, and we've done statistical analysis on this, that this bears this out, small-town America makes a greater contribution to national security than major metropolitan areas as a percentage of their population. And it has to do, I think, with, as I indicated in my blog, it has to do with that sense of the community and the sense of responsibility that we have sort of collectively to take care of each other. And that, unfortunately, that seems to be lost in really kind of major metropolitan areas where folks are just kind of, keep their head down, go their own way, and they're not thinking about those kinds of things. But rural America is still close-knit. It's woven into our DNA that we are, we're part of communities. We belong to things that are bigger than ourselves. When our community suffers, we feel it and we suffer right with them. And we're there to try and make a difference. And so broadly speaking, our nation is our community. And so as we have that sort of sense of service that tends to permeate rural communities around the country, that extends up to the federal level. So when there's a call, you saw in World War II, I mean, folks in small town America, they weren't waiting for the federal government to say, hey, tap you on the shoulder, you're next. No, they were going in significant number, not waiting for their draft board to notify them, but going to serve without reservation, without hesitation. And that has continued to this day. Not only in, obviously World War I, World War II, but the more modern era conflicts and right up to now that is the case. And it makes me very, very proud of the communities that I represent, because we have an inordinate amount of veterans in the 1st District as compared to major metropolitan areas across the country. We may be small in number, but as a percentage of servants, we really outperform the rest of the country.
Very well said about our veterans. Congressman Rick Crawford, I appreciate you coming on the program as always, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you.